the United Nations. Secretary General's letter thus constitutes an express acceptance of obligations in writing within the meaning of Article 35 of the 1969 Vienna Convention and general international law. That power and that duty, duly accepted by the Secretary General, and which are therefore part of United Nations law, are limited only by the requirement that the Secretary General choose one of the means of settlement enumerated by Article 33. Even more to the point, the context and the object and purpose of the agreement also make it perfectly clear that the Secretary General's decision was intended to be binding upon the parties without need for their subsequent approval. Article 4.2 was included in the agreement precisely to ensure that there would be a final and complete resolution to the controversy if the parties themselves failed to agree on the means of settlement. The responsibilities of the Secretary General under Article 4.2 are engaged when there is no agreement between the parties. To suggest, as Venezuela now does, that the binding character of his decision on the means of settlement is conditioned on the parties' agreement with that decision, when they actually agreed to empower him to break their deadlock and avoid a permanent impasse, stands the Geneva Agreement on its head. It defeats its very object and purpose. Article 4.2 ends with the words, quote, until the controversy has been resolved. The terms of the agreement make it plain that the parties did not intend for the controversy to remain unresolved. Their object and purpose was precisely to avoid a permanent impasse. This is reflected in the title of the agreement, to resolve the controversy, and the preambular language that the parties have reached the following agreement to resolve the present controversy. If, to the contrary, the parties had left themselves free to disregard the decision of the Secretary General on the means of settlement, there would have been no assurance that the controversy would ever be resolved. Either party, by simply refusing to accept the Secretary General's decision, could have single-handedly prevented the resolution of the controversy and thwarted the object and purpose of the 1966 agreement. And this is confirmed by the negotiations that resulted in the 1966 agreement and the contemporaneous statements of the parties as to its meaning, to which I will now turn. To be sure, it is not necessary in these proceedings to invoke the travaux préparatoires or the conduct of the parties, given the plain meaning of the terms of the agreement, but it may still be worthwhile to examine them, if only to confirm that the terms of the agreement mean exactly what they say. That is, that the parties empowered the Secretary General to decide on the means of settlement of their controversy, that his decision would be binding on them, and that he was to continue to exercise his power to choose the means of settlement until a final resolution of the controversy was achieved. Mr. President, this might be an appropriate place, if you deem it convenient, to take the afternoon coffee break. If not, I'm pleased to continue.
Please continue. We will observe the coffee break at the end of the second part of your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. President. I shall. Now, this is reflected first in the joint statement issued by the parties on 17 February 1966, immediately upon conclusion of the Geneva Agreement. This document is at tab 9 of your folders. It begins, as a consequence of the deliberations, an agreement was reached whose stipulations will enable a definitive solution of these problems. And it concludes that the agreement provides the means to resolve the dispute which was harming relations between two neighbors. purpose of Article 4.2 and the negotiations leading to its adoptions were described contemporaneously by the foreign minister of Venezuela, who led Venezuela's delegation in Geneva, in his address to the Venezuelan National Congress, calling for ratification of the agreement on 17 March 1966. The address is at tab 10 of your folders. As you can see there, Foreign Minister Iribarren underscored that Venezuela's objective at Geneva was to obtain an agreement that would assure a complete, final, and binding resolution of the controversy. He had little faith that this would be accomplished by further negotiations, given the firmly entrenched positions of the parties on the validity of the 1899 arbitral award. This is why, he explained, when the UK proposed that the Mixed Commission be given 10 years to reach an agreement resolving the controversy, Venezuela responded that the Commission should have a very limited life of only 3 months before advancing to the next stage of the dispute settlement process. The parties ultimately agreed on a 4-year mandate for the Commission as a compromise. The Venezuelan foreign minister explained to the National Congress that his main goal in the negotiations was to make sure that if, as expected, the Mixed Commission failed to resolve the controversy diplomatically, it would not remain unresolved indefinitely, but would be submitted to binding international dispute settlement so that a definitive solution would ultimately be achieved. In the speech he gave urging ratification of the agreement, he described precisely how this goal was to be achieved. Finally, in an attempt to seek a respectable solution to the problem, I put forward a third Venezuelan proposal that would lead to the solution for the borderline issue in 3 successive stages, each with their respective time frame, with the requirement that there had to be an end to the process. A mixed commission, B, mediation, C, international arbitration. This third Venezuelan proposal was rejected by the British at the London meeting in December 1965, but, according to the foreign minister, he made the same proposal in a slightly different language at Geneva, which the UK and British Guyana ultimately came to accept. He explained the final stage of negotiations and the resulting agreement in the following terms. In conclusion, due to Venezuelan objections accepted by Great Britain, there exists an unequivocal interpretation that the only person participating in the selection of the means of solution will be the Secretary General of the United Nations and not the Assembly. Last, and in compliance with Article 4, if no satisfactory solution for Venezuela is reached, the award of 1899 should be revised through arbitration or a judicial recourse. The foreign minister left no doubt about what Venezuela intended, and the parties understood by his insistence that judicial recourse be authorized under the 1966 agreement. After some informal discussions, our delegation chose to leave a proposal on the table similar to the third formula, which had been rejected in London, adding to it recourse to the International Court of Justice. The delegations of Great Britain and British Guyana, after studying in detail the proposal, objected to the specific mention of recourse to arbitration and to the ICJ. The objection was bypassed by replacing that specific intention by referring to Article 33 of the United Nations Charter, which includes those 2 procedures, that is, arbitration and recourse to the International Court of Justice, and the possibility of achieving an agreement was again on the table. It was on the basis of this Venezuelan proposal that the Geneva Agreement was reached. Thus, it was Venezuela which proposed that Article 4 be drafted so as to assure a definitive resolution of the controversy, ultimately, if so decided by the Secretary General, by arbitration, or recourse to the International Court of Justice. There is thus no doubt, Mr. President, from either the terms of the agreement, the negotiating history, or the contemporaneous statements by the parties immediately following its conclusion, that Article 4.2 was intended to assure that there would be a final resolution of the border controversy, that the Secretary General was empowered to decide on the means of settlement to be employed, choosing from among those listed in Article 33 of the Charter, and that the parties understood and intended that if the Secretary General so decided, the controversy would be settled by the ICJ. This was Venezuela's understanding of the Geneva Agreement and of Article 4.2 in particular at the time it signed and ratified the agreement in 1966, that the Secretary General was empowered to decide on the means of settlement, including recourse to the ICJ, and his decision would be final and binding on the parties, ensuring that there would be a definitive resolution of the controversy over the validity of the 1899 arbitral award. Indeed, as the Foreign Minister of Venezuela himself emphasized, quote, it was on the basis of this Venezuelan proposal that the Geneva Agreement was reached. That was how Venezuela understood the agreement in 1966. Venezuela's current reading of the agreement, to which I will now turn, is completely at odds with the interpretation given by its foreign minister, who negotiated and agreed to its terms and explained their meaning to the National Congress upon ratification. This current reading is set out in 3 documents that Venezuela submitted to the court.
Mr. Reichler, I think that we can stop here. It is an appropriate moment for the court to observe a coffee break of 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I wish you a good coffee, and I hope that it's real and not virtual.
It will be a real one. I will ask all those who have joined us virtually, maybe to have their coffee, but not to go away. We'll be back in 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President.
The meeting is adjourned.
Of my presentation, which addresses Venezuela's current reading of the Geneva Agreement. Their current reading is set out in 3 documents that Venezuela has submitted to the court. A letter from President Nicolás Maduro, dated 18 June 2018, the memorandum submitted on 28 November 2019, and the annex that accompanied that memorandum. Notably, Venezuela has not submitted any contemporaneous documents to the court, and meetings occasionally quote from purported archival documents. None are provided, and no full or formal citations are given. In sum, Venezuela offers no evidence to support its assertions. There are only arguments, 3 of them to be exact, and they are all demonstrably wrong. The first argument, which is set out in President Maduro's letter at tab 11 of your folders, is that the Geneva Agreement provides for the resolution of the controversy between the parties only by means of friendly negotiations. Venezuela reiterates its most strict adherence to what has been legally established for the solution of this controversy through the Geneva